Why is this called Chess960? This is a normal setup for chess. Imagine a chess setup where the bottom pieces are rearranged. Let's do some math to explain this. Let's take a look at how many ways I can rearrange the pieces in the first rank of my chessboard. So I've just kind of taken all the pieces out for the first rank of my chessboard. Remember, in your first rank, you have 2 rooks, 2 knights, 2 bishops, a queen, and a king. Now let's focus on the bishops first. How many ways are there for me to place these 2 bishops? Now remember, for a normal chess game, 1 bishop should be on the light square, 1 bishop should be on the dark square, right? Let's say if this is my light square bishop, how many light squares are there for me to place it in? Notice how for this light square bishop I have over here, notice how there's 4 options for me to place it in. So for my bishops right over here, for my first bishop, I have 4 options for me to place it in on a light square. And for my second bishop, I have 4 dark squares I can place it in, right? So 4 options for the light square, 4 options for the dark square. So in total, there are 16 options for me to sort of rearrange these 2 bishops. All right. Now let's focus on the 2 rooks and the king. Now in Chess960, the king has to be in between the 2 rooks. All right. The king, you cannot have a Chess960 setup where kind of the king is right over here and the 2 rooks are over here. The king has to be sort of in between the 2 rooks so that you're able to castle, right? So how many ways are there for me to rearrange the kings and the 2 rooks in a way there where the king is in between the 2 rooks, right? How many ways are there for me to rearrange that? And in order, so let me just write this down, king and 2 rooks. Now, in order for me to do this, let me just kind of simplify the scenario a little bit, all right? Let's say in a normal chess game, you're dealing with an 8x8 chessboard. Let's just say if we're dealing with a chessboard that only had 3 spots. All right, so there are only 3 squares on this chessboard. All right, and let's say if I wanted to find out, I have a king right over here and I have 2 rooks, and I wanted to find out how many ways are there for me to rearrange this so that the king is in between the 2 rooks, right? Now, normally what would happen is normally you would see that there are 3 total sort of possibilities for this, right? So this is possibility 1. So the first possibility is that the king is here and then the 2 rooks are here, right? That's possibility number 1. Another possibility is that the king is in the middle and then the 2 rooks are to the side. And then finally, the third possibility is that the king is here and the 2 rooks are here, right? That's the amount of ways I can rearrange the king and 2 rooks if there were no restrictions, right? However, because we have restrictions and the king has to be in between the 2 rooks, this is the only sort of arrangement that works. So notice how there were 3 arrangements in total, and only 1/3 of these arrangements worked in order for me to find the amount of sort of arrangements where the king is in between the 2 rooks. So that's kind of the formula in order to find out the amount of ways the king can sort of fit in between the 2 rooks, right? What you do is you multiply the total amount of ways I can rearrange the king and the rooks, assuming there were no rules, right, applied, and I multiply that by 1/3 because only 1/3 of those possible, total possibilities actually have the king in between the 2 rooks, and that's going to give me the amount of possibilities where the king is in between the 2 rooks. All right, so total possibilities multiplied by 1/3 gives me king in between 2 rooks. Now, so if I were to look back on my chessboard right over here, okay, so looks like I have my 2 bishops here, so there's only 6 spots remaining. Okay, so there are only 6 spots remaining, it looks like. Now, how many ways are there for me to sort of place down the king and the 2 rooks in total, right? Notice how there are 6 options for me to place down the things. So let's say if I wanted to place down the rook first, there are 6 options for me at first, right? So there are 6 options for me at first. Now, if I place the rook down, well, how many places do I have left? I have 5 places. So if I wanted to place down the king, now there would be 5 slots open, right? Let's say if I place the king here. All right. So now there are 5 options. How many ways are there for me to place down this rook? Well, now notice how when I place the king down, there are only 4 options now. So I'm going to multiply all of these options together. Now, one last thing I have to take into consideration is that, well, notice how I have 2 rooks, right? Notice how this position right over here, if I were to sort of remove the queen and 2 knights, let's say I'll place them up here, right? If we were just to focus on the first row right over here, notice how this position is the same as this position right over here, right? You have 2 rooks, so you're able to sort of if you place this rook in the same position as this rook, and you sort of swap their positions, I mean, it's the same position, right? So notice how, because we can have two identical rooks, right? Because we have two rooks, then it doesn't matter if these rooks sort of change their position, right? We still end up with the same position. So because there are two rooks, what I actually have to do is I have to divide 6 times 5 times 4. All of this I've gathered up right over here. I have to divide that by 2 because there are two identical rooks. So kind of it's going to be half the amount of, kind of the positions if these rooks were not identical, right? If these rooks were not identical, then the total amount of ways we can rearrange this would just be 6 times 5 times 4. But because the two rooks are identical, then, well, this position is the same as this position, so we essentially halved our total amount of sort of positions if the two rooks weren't identical, right? So 6 times 5 times 4 divided by 2, that's going to be equal to 60. And that's going to be equal to the total amount of ways I'm able to rearrange my king and the two rooks without any restriction. Now, we said how if I wanted to find out the amount of ways I rearrange the king and two rooks where the king is in the middle, all I have to do is I have to take the total amount I have and I multiply it by 1/3. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my 60 here, and I'm just going to multiply that by 1/3, right? So then I'm going to get 20 as my answer. So that means the amount of ways I can rearrange the king and two rooks where the king is in the middle is going to be 20 ways, right? The king has to be in the center. Let's say I rearrange it like this, all right? All that's left is queen. All that's left is a queen and two knights, right? I have to find out a way to rearrange these pieces. Now, these are the remaining ones. So let me just write that down. The queen and the two knights. Now, once again, right, notice how there are 3 slots open. So let's say I place the queen in one of these 3 slots. So at first, there are 3 options. Then notice how there are, let me pick this knight right over here. Let's say I place it here, right? So notice how when I place the knight down, right, there were 2 options the knight could have gone to, right? It could have gone to here, or it could have gone to here. So there are 2 options for that knight. And finally, we're left with the remaining knight, which only has 1 option, right? Only 1 slot left. All right. And once again, using the same logic, because there were 2 knights, I have to divide this number by 2, right? So if I do this, I get 3. So we said how for our bishops, we have 16 ways to arrange those. For my king and my 2 rooks, we have 20 ways to arrange those after we place the bishops down. And after we placed all these pieces down, we have 3 ways to rearrange the queen and the 2 horses. So 16 multiplied by 20 multiplied by 3 gives me 960, which is the total amount of ways we can rearrange all those pieces.